So we just talked about the types of counseling. Now we're going to transition to the actual counselor and then some of the qualities that a good counselor has. Again, most leaders are not formally trained on the counseling process. And really, counseling is about communication. So it needs to be two-way communication with the subordinate and the leader. It can't just be dominated by the leader, telling the subordinate, everything they did wrong, or everything they did right for that matter. The subordinate needs to be able to weigh in on that as well. Effective counselors listen more than they speak. Sometimes I would say that counseling does need to be a little bit more directive, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But even in those circumstances, the subordinate should be speaking quite a bit and giving their side of the issue. So let's look at some of the qualities of the counselor. Well, respect, that's a given. If you go into a counseling session not having any respect for the subordinate, that's going to come out in the communication, and the subordinate will be less receptive to what you have to say. And some things that go along with that are self-awareness on the part of the counselor, cultural awareness, empathy, and credibility. Empathy is one of the leader attributes underneath character, and self-awareness, you could say, is one of the leader attributes underneath intellect. So the three basic counseling skills defined in this doctrine are active listening, responding, and appropriate questioning. And the most important of these three is active listening. Active listening implies listening thoughtfully and deliberately to capture the nuances of the subordinate's language. And this could be a challenge for a leader that happens to be an extrovert, that is very verbal and has a lot of things to say about particular issues. So I find myself having to work at this quite a bit, actually, when I'm mentoring a subordinate leader, or having a discussion. I have a lot of stuff to say, and so I have found that it can be helpful to deliberately stop yourself from wanting to speak, and then just listen and kind of develop the things that you want to say. It certainly helps in the communication. Active listening communicates that the soldier values the subordinate and enables reception of the subordinate's message. Again, looking at the investment of time in counseling, which I think is probably the most important aspect of leader development, is the time that you're spending with that subordinate. Some key elements of active listening: eye contact. That can be kind of difficult for certain personality types, but it's something that leaders have to work on. It helps to show sincere interest. And then going back to the active listening, I found myself guilty of this quite a bit. Avoid interrupting. So one of the other aspects of counseling is responding. And this is also a skill, really being able to verbalize a summary of what is being talked about during the counseling session, and then clarifying what the subordinate is saying. And sometimes that's restating that in your own words. That does show that genuine interest. So so appropriate questioning. Open-ended questions are going to be more valuable than questions that elicit a yes or no answer. So going back to the saw example in the previous video, looking at the saw gunner and saying, why do you think you were having some issues correcting malfunctions with the saw during the night live fire? And then leave it at that, and kind of watch that subordinate articulate and verbalize to you what was going through their mind, and what they were working through, as opposed to saying, hey, do you think you had some issues with the saw and the live fire? So really kind of looking at how you're framing your questions, and you do that in preparation for the counseling. So some counseling practices: don't judge, especially without being informed of the subordinate side of the story. And this a lot of times will go back to the event-oriented type of counseling. Stereotypes, we're all guilty of those. An example of that would be a soldier who had a financial issue for a month. They didn't pay their star card or whatever. And so an easy stereotype would be, these dumb young privates don't know anything about money, and that's actually not always true. Losing emotional control, this can be a challenging business, Army leadership, and so going back to self-awareness and self-regulation being important qualities of a counselor. Inflexible counseling methods, hey, I'm not going to listen to what they have to say. I'm just going to write this stuff down. You're going to receive it. You're going to sign it. And then we're going to move on to the next thing. And then follow up, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Focusing the attention on the subordinate. Remember, it's a time investment. So you definitely want to remember the audience of the counseling, and that happens to be the subordinate that is being counseled. Remain objective. It should be a professional discussion more than anything, especially when it comes to topics of the subject of performance. When you're kind of dealing with some of the crisis issues, it's all right to let your guard down and try to display that empathy for them. But at the end of the day, we're trying to help the subordinate out, whether it's improve their performance or help them work through a crisis issue. So if you are overly emotional, that can also be an obstacle in helping the soldier. Army leaders are often not formally trained counselors. We have some tools like this doctrine, but we all have our limitations, and we often need to go outside of the unit in order to get that assistance for a soldier. One of the issues with counseling is resistance, either on the part of the counselor or part of the subordinate. The counselor may not want to counsel because they don't necessarily feel that they're good at it. They're introverts, and so and what I mean by introverts is any personal interaction that they have can be kind of draining because it's not something that they're really familiar with or comfortable with. Introverts are often very comfortable with introspection and reflection, but when it comes to verbalizing things to other people, it can be challenging for them. So a lot of leaders tend to put counseling off, and that's understandable, I think. Kind of go into that. Leaders themselves have not been counseled, or they don't have the right role model for counseling. And then also there's the time issue. We talked about professionalism and that this is a professional process. And so, when it comes to overcoming resistance, just remember to be objective, and that it's about the betterment of the individual, the team, and the organization. One of the last things we'll talk about is the stages of counseling, and really this is kind of common sense. Identifying the need for counseling. So obviously for a performance counseling, that's kind of a routine function. But as events come up, especially crisis or referral events, or just a specific instance of a substandard performance. Say, hey, I should probably sit down with, my subordinate and do a counseling with them. And then an overlooked step is preparing for the counseling, and we'll talk about that briefly. So, some of the things in preparing for a counseling is the time. It has to be a deliberate thing, especially with everything that's going on. Every unit has so many different priorities, so many different things going on. And so telling your subordinates, like, hey, we need to sit down and have a counseling session, at this date time group to talk about X. And that's, really the first step in making it happen. And then making sure that they know well in advance. So this is just a approach to counseling, kind of a little chart, and you can just kind of see the advantages and disadvantages. What we mostly talked about earlier was the combined approach, and then this is the least optimal, and this is one that a lot of leaders default to, is the directive method. It's fast. Hey, this is what I have to say. You're going to receive it. Move out. But it does not encourage subordinates to be part of the solution. And there may be times where this is appropriate, especially for just maybe some egregious errors. A lot of times character issues or when soldiers have misconduct that are a result of character. Again, I think there's value in hearing, their side of the story, but a lot of times that initial counseling post blast is going to tend to be directive. Remember that counseling is subordinate centered, or it should be subordinate centered. Active listening, we've talked about that several times during this, and then being specific. Don't just have generalizations like, your performance was really not up to snuff last month. You had a couple issues. It's like, no, be specific about what it is, and then tie it to doctrine or regulation. As often as you can. That's one of the benefits of Army doctrine, is it's a black and white, objective kind of way to look at things. Coming up with a plan of action, don't be too broad. Find one or two realistic goals for them to work on in the coming month or months when moving forward. And then the last thing, just the counseling needs to be recorded, and the 4856 is the system of record, so to speak, that we use for counseling. As subordinate leaders become non-commissioned officers, using the support form, the NCOER support form, and 4856, maybe coupled with a Word document or something like that, might be more appropriate. But for all intents and purposes, the 4856 is what we use to record counseling. One of the last things that we'll talk about real quick is just how counseling is tied to leader development. At the end of the day, every soldier that we counsel is a form of leader development. And just kind of looking at the fundamentals of leader development, the aspect of leader development that counseling is applicable to is providing feedback. And this is pertaining to immediate feedback when you observe things. And this is a nice complement to counseling. One last thing to remember, it takes multiple observations before a pattern of behavior emerges, which is why counseling is so important. All right, well, that will do it for this video. and we'll talk about leader development in the subsequent video.